You think people go to work for money. They don't.
No, not at all.
Right. They go to work for what money actually buys. And that realization right there is like the exact psychological engine behind one of those powerful tools in clinical programming.
The token economy.
Exactly. So today on the deep dive, we are decoding this ultimate behavior hack. We're tearing down the academic fluff around conditioned reinforcers and showing you how to actually engineer behavior in the real world.
Yeah, because it really is the cornerstone of clinical control.
It totally is.
Yeah.
We're looking at the exact mechanisms that make or break these systems, how to avoid the traps that cause them to crash, and what it really takes to master this for your clinical practice and your board exam.
Right, covering BACB 6th edition task list item G.4, conditioned reinforcers and token economies. Because to build a system that actually changes behavior, you have to start by understanding how to, well, manufacture value out of thin air.
Manufacture value. I like that.
Yeah, that is what a conditioned reinforcer essentially is. It's taking something totally neutral, a piece of plastic, a check mark on a whiteboard, maybe a clicker sound, and systematically pairing it with something the learner already loves.
Until that neutral thing becomes a reward itself, right?
Precisely. Because it has zero inherent value. The value is entirely built through their learning history.
So wait, is this basically why a gold star means absolutely nothing to a kid until the exact moment they realize, like, it buys them extra recess?
Yes, that aha moment is everything. But as clinicians, we can't just cross our fingers and wait for that connection to magically happen. We have to engineer it.
Right, because if you just hand a kid a sticker and walk away, it's just a piece of paper.
Exactly. We take those completely neutral items and we deliberately transform them into behavioral drivers. And we do this through a highly structured pairing process.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of that pairing process.
Yeah.
Because a successful token economy isn't just about handing out one specific reward over and over.
No, definitely not.
You don't want a token that only buys like a single type of candy. You want to build what's called a generalized conditioned reinforcer, or a GCR.
Right, because if your token only buys a single type of candy, it's just a conditioned reinforcer for that specific candy.
Which is super limiting.
Extremely.
Yeah.
The limitation there is that human motivation fluctuates constantly.
Right.
If your learner just ate a massive lunch, their motivation, what we call the establishing operation, or EO for food, is practically zero.
Yeah, they're stuffed. They don't care about your Skittles.
Exactly. So if your token only buys food, your token is now worthless. But a generalized condition reinforcer bypasses that problem entirely.
Because it buys a bunch of different things.
Yes. It gains its clinical power because it has been paired simultaneously with many different unconditioned and conditioned backup reinforcers.
So the token buys the candy, but it also buys, 5 minutes of iPad time, a break from a difficult task, or a trip to the park.
It acts like an all-access pass.
An all-access pass, yeah.
Yeah. And because it has this multiple pairing history, a GCR does not depend on a single establishing operation. It is highly resistant to satiation.
Wow, okay. So if they aren't hungry, they might still want screen time.
Right. And if they don't want screen time, they might want a break. The token retains its value regardless of how their specific cravings shift throughout the day.
That is huge.
It is. You are effectively insulating your intervention against the constant ebb and flow of human motivation.
There's a really clear case study we were looking at in the sources that shows this pairing happening in real time in a classroom.
Oh, the teacher with the coupons.
Yeah, exactly. A teacher gives out these little paper coupons to students as rewards for on-task behavior. And the students love the coupons because they trade them in on Fridays.
Right.
But whenever this teacher delivers a coupon, she explicitly thanks the student, looks them in the eye, and shakes their hand.
And notice what's happening beneath the surface there. Initially, that handshake is a neutral stimulus.
Yeah, a kid isn't doing math problems just to get a handshake.
Exactly. But the teacher is systematically delivering that neutral handshake at the exact same moment she delivers the established reinforcer, which is the coupon.
So the two things become linked.
Yes. Through that repeated, simultaneous pairing, the handshake itself begins to take on reinforcing properties. She is actively building a brand new reinforcer into the student's psychological repertoire.
And the student doesn't even realize it's happening.
Not at all. It's pure conditioning.
But wait, I want to challenge this for a second, or at least clarify a boundary here.
Yeah.
Because this can get kind of tricky in practice.
Sure. What's the scenario?
What if the client just inherently likes the physical object you were trying to use as a token? There was another scenario in the sources. about a guy with an autism diagnosis who obsessively chewed his shirt collar.
Right. I remember this one.
Yeah, so the clinical team wanted to reinforce him for keeping his shirt out of his mouth, so they set a timer, and when he successfully refrained, they handed him a button. The catch being, the guy was an avid button collector. He just loved buttons. So is that actually a token economy?
No, it is absolutely not.
Really? Even though he's earning a small item for a target behavior?
No, and understanding why it's not is crucial. This is a hard clinical line. If the client collects buttons as a hobby, the button is acting as a primary, already established specific reinforcer.
Oh, I see. He wants the button for the sake of the button.
Exactly. He isn't going to trade that button in for an iPad later. He's going to put it in his pocket and take it home. In a true token economy, the token itself must act purely as a medium of exchange.
So it has to be currency.
Yes. A piece of plastic has to be utterly useless until the clinician systematically pairs it with a backup reinforcer.
Okay, so the token has to be the currency, not the commodity. If the learner just wants the object itself, you're not running an economy. You are just running a standard reinforcement schedule where you hand them things they like.
Bingo. A token is a bridge. It is a placeholder for value, not the value itself. And this distinction dictates how you build the rest of your programming.
Okay, so let's say you've successfully paired the token. The learner understands the piece of plastic is a placeholder for value. But that value is incredibly fragile, right?
Very fragile.
Because if you don't give them something worthwhile to actually spend it on, the whole illusion shatters and they stop working. So how do we actually build a localized economy that keeps them hooked?
Well, you have to design the system with 3 mandatory non-negotiable components. Skip one, and the system fails.
Okay, what are they?
First, you must explicitly identify and define the target behaviors. The learner needs to know exactly what actions earn the currency.
Makes sense.
Second, you must have a highly consistent mechanism for delivering those tokens. And third, you must provide a curated menu of backup reinforcers that the tokens can be exchanged for.
There's a clinical example of this in a group home setting from the text that illustrates the mechanics perfectly.
The one with Eli?
Yeah, Eli. So he's a resident who earns tokens for specific, clearly defined, appropriate behaviors, like completing his morning routine or engaging calmly with his housemates.
Right.
He holds onto these tokens and then physically trades them in at a special store set up inside the group home. So he's buying edibles, tangible items, or specific privileges.
Yeah, Eli's scenario gives us the basic framework, but the real clinical power lies in the economics of how you price that store.
The economics of it.
Yes, there are strict rules of token economics that you have to respect. When you first implement a token economy with a new learner, the initial exchange ratio must be incredibly low.
Wait, meaning the backup items need to be cheap and the tokens need to be easy to get.
Very easy. The entire goal of day one is getting the learner to contact the contingency.
Okay.
If they have to work for 3 days just to earn enough tokens to buy one small piece of candy, they are never going to experience the payoff. The tokens will never acquire true value in their brain.
Because it's just too much work.
Right. They need early, frequent wins. One easy task equals 1 token, and 1 token buys an immediate reward.
But you can't keep it that cheap forever, right?
Hmm.
Because if you do, they just hoard tokens, buy everything in the store by Tuesday, and then have zero motivation to behave appropriately for the rest of the week.
Right, which is why your system must evolve. As the learner's behavior improves and their token income increases, the clinician has to adapt the economy.
So you change the prices.
Yes. You increase the number of backup items available, you introduce highly desirable, expensive luxury items, and eventually you devalue the tokens by requiring more work to earn them, or by raising the prices in the store to mimic natural contingencies.
So designing a token economy is basically like managing inflation.
That's a great way to put it, actually.
Because if you set the prices too high at the start, the economy crashes because nobody wants to work it. The labor simply isn't worth the paycheck.
Exactly.
But if they get too rich later on because prices stay low while their skills improved, you get behavioral inflation. The currency loses its leverage.
And that connects directly to the psychological concept of ratio strain.
Ratio strain, right.
Think about what happens in the brain when the expectations outweigh the perceived payoff. If you sit a kid down and ask them to complete 100 complex math problems for a single marshmallow right out of the gate, you hit their behavioral breaking point immediately.
Yeah, they're going to look at the worksheet, look at the marshmallow, and their brain says, absolutely not.
Right. That is ratio strain. You haven't built any behavioral momentum first.
So to avoid ratio strain, you start with that low ratio we talked about. One easy problem gets one token gets a marshmallow. You build a trust that the system actually pays out.
Yes, build the momentum.
Then, once they buy in, you systematically thin the schedule. 2 problems for a token, then 5. You are increasing the response effort while manipulating the purchasing power.
Exactly. You are constantly balancing the scales to keep the learner engaged without giving away the store for free.
It makes sense conceptually, but it also sounds like a system with a massive margin for error. Like, there are so many moving parts here.
There really are.
So what happens when a BCBA attempts to build this localized economy and it just completely falls apart? Let's unpack the common clinical mistakes that cause these systems to crash.
Yeah, let's do it, because that leads right into how this is tested. The majority of clinical failures stem directly from ignoring the economics we just broke down.
Okay, what's mistake number 1?
Mistake 1 is exactly what we just discussed, setting initial exchange ratios too high. Clinicians get overly ambitious.
They want too much too soon.
Right. They want to see huge behavioral changes immediately, so they demand too much work for too little payoff at the onset. The learner experiences ratio strain, decides the effort isn't worth it, and the system dies on day 1.
Makes total sense. Mistake number 2 has to be a lack of variety in the backup reinforcers, right?
Yes. Failing to offer a variety. Going back to Eli in the group home, if Eli's store only sells potato chips, you are putting all your behavioral leverage into one basket.
Which destroys the entire concept of the generalized conditioned reinforcer.
Exactly. If he only buys chips, your token isn't a GCR, it's just a proxy for chips. And the moment Eli decides he is sick of potato chips, your token economy collapses due to satiation.
So you have to keep it fresh.
You must offer a wide, constantly rotating variety of backup reinforcers to keep the tokens insulated against shifting motivation.
Got it. And the third major mistake from the sources.
The third one is clinicians relying heavily on punishment within the token system, like taking tokens away.
Oh yeah, fines.
This is a huge trap. The sources explicitly state that a token economy requires a fundamental willingness to promote reinforcement contingencies, not punishment.
But what if they do something dangerous?
Well, in Eli's case, some staff members wanted to use response cost. They wanted to fine him, taking tokens out of his bank every time he was aggressive. Now, response cost is a valid behavioral procedure in some contexts, but if your primary focus in a token economy is penalizing the learner rather than reinforcing the targeted behaviors, you are entirely missing the clinical point.
You can't just fine a behavior into existence.
Exactly. You must build the reinforcement contingency first and heavily weight the system toward earning, not losing.
Which brings us perfectly to the ultimate exam trap. This is the scenario that completely trips up people taking their board exams, and it happens all the time in clinics too.
It's the classic Pearson VUE trap.
Yeah, so the scenario goes like this. A clinician sets up a beautiful token board. They clearly define the target behaviors. They hand out the tokens immediately when the good behavior occurs. But the behavior doesn't increase at all.
Right.
The system fails immediately upon implementation. Why does that happen?
Because they implemented tokens without established value. It is the single most common exam trap on this topic. They handed the learner a piece of plastic and assumed the learner would care without ever putting in the work to pair that plastic with a backup reinforcer.
It's like handing a teenager a stack of Monopoly money and expecting them to mow your lawn.
Yes. Perfect analogy.
I mean, it doesn't matter how fast you hand them the colorful paper. If it doesn't spend anywhere, they aren't going to work for it.
That is exactly the logic you need. So if you are listening to this right now and preparing for your exam, here is the elite rapid-fire strategy you need to lock in.
Let's hear it.
If you see this scenario, a token system fails immediately upon implementation. Choose this. The tokens were not established as conditioned reinforcers. They had no backup value.
Got it. What's the next one to watch out for?
If you see a question asking how to set the initial exchange ratio in a brand new token economy, choose this. Ratios should be low to ensure frequent reinforcement.
Right. Start cheap, get them to contact the contingency, and build that trust.
And finally, if you see a question asking why generalized conditioned reinforcers are effective, choose this. They do not depend on a single establishing operation for their effectiveness.
Okay, so just to clarify that for everyone listening, the absolute superpower of a GCR on the exam is that it's immune to satiation because it buys everything, not just one thing.
With absolute authority, yes. That is the exact mechanism. A GCR bypasses the vulnerability of fluctuating motivation. If you understand that single concept, you understand the engine of the entire token economy.
Okay, so we know how to manufacture the value. We know how to manage the behavioral inflation. We know how to avoid ratio strain. And we know exactly how they're going to test us on this.
Yep.
But let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. How do we apply this to become top-tier clinicians? Because nobody wants to walk around handing a 25-year-old plastic tokens for the rest of their life.
Right, and application is where this theory actually becomes life-changing for the client. Every token economy you design is fundamentally a bridge.
A bridge to where?
You are bridging the massive gap between a highly contrived, highly structured clinical setting and the chaotic, unpredictable real world. Because the real world does not operate on a dense, predictable token schedule.
Yeah, your boss doesn't hand you a red plastic chip every time you send an email.
No.
The cashier doesn't give you a token for waiting quietly in line.
Exactly. So your job as a clinician is not to keep a learner dependent on a token economy forever. Your job is to systematically transfer behavioral control away from your contrived plastic tokens and hand that control over to the naturally occurring reinforcers in their actual environment.
So you fade the board.
You fade the board.
Right.
You replace the token exchange with natural praise, pure attention, internal satisfaction, or just natural breaks in their day. At Amethyst Therapy Services Inc., we build clinicians, not just test passers. www.amethysttherapyservices.com, info at amethysttherapyservices.com.
It's so true.
And I want to leave you with one final advanced clinical thought based on the fading procedures we analyzed today, just something to mull over.
Wait on us.
Ask yourself this. When does a token economy actually end? Because if you are a truly elite behavior analyst, your ultimate goal from day one of designing a token economy is to put that exact economy out of business, fading it entirely into the natural contingencies of the real world.
Wow. Put your own economy out of business. You go to work for what the money buys, but the ultimate goal is finding value in the work itself.
Exactly. Keep bridging that gap.
If this helped you, follow behavioral intelligence, share this episode with another RBT or BCBA who's studying, and leave a comment or review. That's how we grow, and how I keep creating high-level content for you. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.